Sometimes when you want to learn something new, the best thing to do is to just jump in head first and go for broke. Then once you are done, you can see what you have learned in the process and what you can utilize in your next project. So in today's video I will be doing just that by painting a tag from Corvus Belli's Infinity, and I'll paint not one but two major sources of light reflecting on the model. One from the orange glow of the energy sword he's wielding, and one emanating from the greenish yellow toxic sludge on the ground. I'll walk you through the thinking process and the execution, showing you some of the mistakes I made, and once the dust has settled, hopefully both you and me will be closer to understanding and painting some cool OSL on our minis. So let's do it. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANS Miniatures. First of all, I sprayed a quick zenithal prime over the model to help with achieving nice vibrant colors. Then I started applying all the base colors, which gave me time to think about what I wanted to do and what the story is going to be behind the scene this model will be in. I knew that I wanted to go for something close to the original color scheme, with some blue and turquoise panels with some black and white on the shoulders and a red tabard in the style of the military orders in the Infinity universe. I also knew that I wanted the sword to emit a very strong glow that would reflect on the entire left side of the model, completely illuminating the torso and the head on the side. But it should be still visible on the rest of the panels as well, facing the sword, like for example the legs. Based on the pose, I imagine that this guy is defending against something towering above him, something that is about to strike a blow on his sword, like a Jedi dueling a Sith Lord but with giant robots. But at this point I had no clue that I also wanted the light coming from the ground. The idea came later, as you will see. Once I was done with applying all the base coats, I needed to add some definition by shading the model. I took some watered down black paint and simply blacklined the entire thing. I will take care of the rest of the shading later. With the base colors done, now it was time to start creating the highlights, including the OSL effect coming from the sword. Because for now I only had a vague idea in my head about how the whole thing would come together, I decided to just go with the sketch that I could refine and smooth out later. This allowed me to go relatively fast with the highlighting process. I didn't have to care about smoothness and creating perfect blends. Instead, I could concentrate on where I wanted to have the regular highlights and the glow effects from the sword. I have done OSL effects on models before, like for example when I painted Abaddon the Despoiler recently, but that was relatively subtle, and this time I wanted something really in your face and obvious, so I started by adding what I was already familiar with. Painting in the highlights on the right side of the blue and turquoise panels was quite straightforward. I created the highlights with a zenithal light source in mind, shining from above. But on the left side, closer to the sword, I replaced the blue and blue-green highlights with red ones, trying to imagine where the light from the sword would be reflecting. The most important rule of OSL is that the source of the light, the sword in this case, has to be the brightest light, and all the reflections should be somewhat darker. Things closest to the sword, so essentially the torso and the head, should be also close to the sword in brightness, but the further we go from there, the darker the reflections should be. This is of course easy to understand in theory, but actually executing the theory is always difficult in my experience. But fortunately this is just a sketch for now, and I will be able to make some changes and refine it later if I don't get it right at first, which is exactly what's going to happen. Once I placed the lights with the first highlights, I started to increase the brightness with all the colors and of course the OSL effect as well. Around halfway through this process, I started to realize that the base and the bottom side of the model seemed somewhat boring and empty. So I was thinking, what if we dial this little test up even further and I get to test not just the orange OSL but a green one as well. So now our hero is battling this monstrous foe somewhere in the enemy's lair, and of course, since the opponent is clearly evil, there is some toxic radioactive sludge on the ground, since that is what evil lairs should look like, right? To make this happen, I started to apply some yellow-green colors on the edges of the panels facing the ground and shaded the same panels with some Plague Bearer's flesh contrast, which is perfect for the effect I was going for. Now that I was more or less confident where this whole project was headed, I also started to paint the blade. Since this had to be the most colorful and bright point on the model, I started by applying some super bright red ink over the white base in the middle section of the sword. I painted the cutting edges of the sword with some fluorescent red inks, and later in the video you will see me taking care of the white script in the middle of the blade and the edge highlights around the blade. At this stage I was ready with the sketching part and the highlights were more or less in place, although I wasn't entirely happy with them. The model looked quite rough, of course, so I wanted to see how it would look with some of the shading and smoothing in place. So it was time to bust out the airbrush and some inks. The idea here is quite simple. Inks are translucent, so when I shoot them through the airbrush, especially diluted, they will not fully obscure the highlighting I had already done before. What they will do is smoothing out the rough highlights I had created, darkening things down and adding extra tones and vibrancy to the model. I used some blue and turquoise inks to shade the blue and blue-green panels respectively. Then I went in with some purple and black mix in the deeper shadows to create even more contrast. And coincidentally, this is also a perfect mix for shading the red skirt. Then the green OSL areas got a spray of Tesseract Glow technical paint, which essentially works as a fluorescent green ink. Following the same logic, all the red glowing parts received some layers of fluorescent red ink glazes. Once I was done with the shading, I went back and fixed up the highlights, which got muted down by the inks, using the same colors I had already used for the highlights before, paying special attention to restoring the edge highlights. With the smoothing and shading done, I had to realize that I simply didn't like the end result enough. The green glow looked good, but the orange one felt wrong somehow. After a bit of consideration, I decided that the problem is that it should either be way more subtle, acting only as a secondary highlight like the one I used on Abaddon a few videos back, or it should be much stronger, completely illuminating the model. Now it was just sitting right in the middle, hitting the perfect spot of meh. But since this project was about going all in, it was an easy decision to dial it up further. Also, adding stuff is always easier than taking it away, so there is that too. So I darkened down some of the blue highlights and increased the size of the orange ones, because I felt that on the left side of the model, the orange glow should overpower every other light. Once I was more happy with the size and placement of the orange glow highlights, I started to increase their brightness further as well, especially on the edges and around the torso and head that are closest to the sword. On the rest of the model, like on the legs for example, I darkened down the glow effect a bit compared to the sketch to better show their distance from the sword. I finished the sword too by highlighting the edges even further with orange fluorescent ink, which is even brighter than the red one I used before. I used the same fluorescent orange ink through the airbrush to smooth out the OSL highlights more. And while I had the airbrush out, I did some more smoothing and shading on some of the other elements too. I added some extra tones to the blues and sprayed some white ink over the wings. All the green OSL areas got a spray of Plague Green Express color because I felt it needed a bit more contrast and shading. This is a bit greener and darker than the Plague Bearer's flesh I used before. Then I increased the contrast further by painting some of the closest edges and some of the rocks in the sludge with pistachio. Finally, now that I thought the source of the glow was bright enough, I applied 2 layers of transparent water effect over the part of the base with the green sludge to make it look like actual liquid. And with that, my little OSL experiment was complete and the end result looks like this. To be honest, I'm not 100% happy with it, but it comes quite close to the scene I imagined in my head and I have learned a lot from doing it. I definitely understand how to paint OSL a little better and I will have a lot more confidence using it in my next project. I hope you guys learned something as well, and if you did, consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. There is a lot more from where this came from. See you guys in the next one.